Hey everybody, mel0n here. Welcome back to another mel0n review. Today we're going to be finishing up part 2 of my review of the RAZER Strider. Now this was a very interesting pad because Razer is advertising this pad as the best of both worlds between a soft and a hard pad and kind of having a hybridized performance profile. However, this pad didn't meet that profile at all. This pad performed very differently, which made this pad definitely a rather odd pad. It's not a bad pad by any means. I actually do think the Strider is a very unique and a very good pad. It just doesn't really meet the performance profiles as advertised. So there's going to be a lot to talk about with the RAZER Strider today, but before we get into it, I did want to get a couple housekeeping things out of the way. Firstly, as always, this video will be fully subtitled and timestamps will be available down in the video description. And this review is in no way or shape or form sponsored or endorsed by Razer. I purchased the Strider myself, so Razer did not provide me with the product for this review. But let's go ahead and get right into it. Let's first talk about how the Strider performed in game, because that is where the Strider deviated from its advertised performance profile the most. Alright, now when it comes to in-game performance, as I mentioned before, Razer is advertising this pad as a best of both worlds between a soft and a hard pad. Now this would make you think that the performance profile for the Strider is going to be a hybrid pad. However, compared to the other hybrid pads I've tried, such as the Focus Ambition, which is my main pad because I do really enjoy hybrid pads, the RAZER Strider deviates from its hybrids pad nature significantly. This pad actually feels significantly more like a speed pad, very similar to how the LGG Neptune felt, a little slower obviously because that is a very fast pad, but it leaned much more into the speed aspects of the pad more than the hybridized control speed feeling that you found in the Focus Ambition, which is very odd because again, this pad seems like it would be a very controlled pad given the consistency of the XY stitching, the surfacing of the pad. Just overall, this pad seems like it would be more of a hybrid pad, but it actually deviates from this and plays much more like a speed pad. Now, of course, there are a lot of reasons as to why this pad does deviate from its hybrid performance profile, but I'll talk about that a little later. And I found that the Strider was best for more dynamic shooting games, more like Overwatch, Quake, Bad Business, Fortnite, that kind of stuff, more dynamic optimized games where you're aiming everywhere all at once and speed is more important. However, when it came to tac shooter performance, the RAZER Strider performed very similarly to how the LGG Neptune performed, where it's just so fast it's very hard to be accurate with it. I had to compensate for this by dropping my centimeter per 360 from 40 to 60 centimeters to try and compensate for the lack of control and the speed of the pad. Now, once I did do that, the pad did perform better, but I don't have to do this on other hybrid pads I've tested. I can play Valorant at 40 centimeter per 360 and have very good consistent accuracy, no problem on the Focus Ambition. However, I can't do that here with the RAZER Strider. So again, despite them both being hybrid pads and being advertised as hybrid pads, the RAZER Strider operates much more like a speed pad rather than a hybrid pad. The pad did still perform well. It is still a good performing pad, but you're definitely going to have to adjust your centimeter per 360 to compensate for the speed found here on the Strider. Now, before we talk about the other aspects of the Strider, I did want to talk about one very unique thing about this pad, and that is the pad's softness. Now again, as Razer is advertising this pad as being the best between a soft and a hard pad, I expected this pad to have about a medium amount of softness, but it turns out this pad is actually very rigid. It still does have a little bit of softness, but the pad is so thick, there's a lot of upward force. So whenever you do press into the pad, you have to fight the pad to keep your mouse down, meaning that things like control variability and pushing into the pad to get a little more control doesn't really work on this pad, which is very interesting. Again, given that according to Razer, this is the best of being a soft and a hard pad, I expected a lot more softness on this pad, but it is in actuality very hard. So if you are someone who does rely on pressing your mouse into your mouse pad to get a little more control, that's not really going to be something you can really do here on the Strider. The Strider is much more reliant on surface friction for its control, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Alrighty, now let's talk about the surfacing of the Strider. Now this is where the Strider gets very odd because there's a lot of aspects about this surfacing that kind of fights against itself, but I'll talk about that in a second. But in terms of feel, the surfacing is a semi-rough surface. The weaving of this pad is actually very odd, where it actually has some unevenness to it. So some weaves will be a little higher, some will be a little lower. It's very odd in how this pad feels. As I mentioned before, this pad is heavily reliant on friction for the overall control you're going to feel in the pad, and I feel like a lot of what Razer tried to do here is they tried to have this pad feel a little more controlled by having an uneven surface, so there's a little more wear against the skates, which does kind of work, but also doesn't kind of work, but I'll talk about that in a second. Now the surfacing itself, as I mentioned before, is this semi-rough kind of surfacing. It is actually pretty abrasive against fingers. Like if I rub my finger really fast across this pad, I'd probably give myself a rug burn. Because of that, you can have some irritation on your skin if you are very sensitive to that. I would highly recommend an arm sleeve while using this pad, just because the surfacing is very abrasive against skin, so I'd highly recommend wearing an arm sleeve. But aside from the surface stitching being a little weird with how it feels, where it really gets weird is the actual stitching itself. Now, one thing I praised the Strider for was this incredibly consistent X and Y axis stitching. It is probably the most consistent surface stitching I've ever seen in a mousepad. I love this. It's incredibly consistent for omnidirectional movements. However, the problem is that the actual weaving of the surface due to this unevenness makes it feel really weird because you have this super consistent stitching layer and then you have a surface weaving that is very inconsistent, which makes this pad feel really weird because, as I mentioned before, Razer's trying to give this pad a little more control, so they made the surface a little uneven to try and give a little more friction between the skates and the mouse pad itself. But it does fight against itself here because if the Strider had a consistent X and Y surface stitching and a consistent surface weaving, it would be a totally different pad. It would probably be better in my opinion, but because of the unevenness of the weaving, it feels very weird. It feels very counteractive to the intended nature of the Strider, and this is partially why the Strider feels so fast, just because it's not a consistent surface weaving. You're not going to have as much friction between the skates and the mouse pad surfacing itself, which makes this pad feel significantly faster. This is also partially where the Strider does kind of feel a little odd as well, because it's not going to be compatible with a lot of skates, but I'll talk about that a little later. I genuinely think the Strider would have been significantly better if they made it a little softer and just had a consistent surface stitching that more highlighted that very, very consistent X and Y surfacing. In the current iteration, it does work. It's just a little weird, and it does require the user to compensate with their centimeter per 360 for specific game types like static games, as we talked about before. All right, now I did also want to talk about control variability, as I do with all mouse pads. Now, because the surface of the Strider is so dense and there's not really a lot of give to the surface and you can't really push your skates into the surface, there's going to be pretty much no control variability on this pad. Even with very small dot skates, you can't really dig into the surface of the Strider very much. Other hybrid pads I've tried, like the Focus and Ambition, do have a little more give and do allow you to do that a little more, but the Strider is unique where it does not allow that at all. It is entirely reliant on friction between the skates and the mouse pad surfacing itself for all the control you're going to feel here on the Strider. All right, now as I mentioned before when I was talking about the surfacing, some skate types are not going to be compatible with the Strider. Overall, I'd highly recommend using bigger surface area skates, or just larger surface area stocks are going to be the ideal use case, because again, this pad is entirely reliant on surface friction. If you have smaller skates on your mouse like half-side speed skates or dot skates or even donut skates, they are just going to feel so fast, they're going to feel uncontrolled, which you're going to have to compensate your centimeter per 360 to make it feel controlled. Again, like I said when I talked about the performance, for static games would rely on a lot of friction, a lot of stopping power. I had to change my centimeter per 360 all the way from 40 to 60 centimeters when I was using dot skates just to try and feel semi-consistent on this pad, but even then, just due to the lack of control, it just felt very shaky a lot of the time. Larger surface area stocks are definitely going to be the way to go here. I was lucky to find an extra set of core pads for my Death Adder V3, and I used those for the majority of my testing, and they felt much more consistent than dots. So this is probably going to be the only mouse pad I think I've ever covered on the channel where I'm going to say not to use dots, which sucks because I genuinely do prefer dot skates and donut skates over stock skates, but they are just not compatible with the Strider unless you're running a very high centimeter per 360. They're just not consistent. You're just better off going with larger surface area skates. Again, the rule of thumb for the Strider here is that the more surface area you have on the bottom of the mouse, the more control you're going to feel against the surfacing of the Strider. So the bigger is better in this use case, when oftentimes it's actually flipped. So again, this is another area where the Strider definitely deviates from a standard hybrid pad, because again, on my Focus and Ambition, I can use dot skates, donut skates, stock skates, no problem at all, and play comfortably at 40 centimeter per 360. Whereas on the Strider, I have to use full area surface skates or compensate my centimeter per 360 to account for the speediness of this pad surfacing. Alrighty, now another area where Razer has done a very interesting take here on the Strider is when it comes to moisture resistance. Now, Razer is advertising the Strider as being 100% moisture resistant, which is true. However, it's actually a little different here because the surface weaving is uneven, and it's the taller and shorter parts of it. It's very bumpy and kind of abrasive to the skin. Water actually sits below the surface stitching, which does kind of make this pad immune to water to an extent, but at the same time though, it does also change the performance of the pad a little bit, because of course, if you have a bunch of water in your fibers, they're not going to rebound as quickly, and there's going to be a lot of effects to that. So while the pad is technically water resistant, it does still affect the performances because the water is not evaporating or draining through the pad. It's just sitting just below the surface layer of the pad. Other hybrid pads I've tried, like the Focus and Ambition, do allow water to get absorbed through the surface. So it's a little better when it comes to that regards on other pads, but again, it's not really water resistant. It just holds the water underneath the surface stitching. I would have much rather seen them have another layer underneath the surfacing where the water could have drained into. It's just a very odd way of dealing with water here on the Strider. It does work, just not as efficiently as it does on a lot of other pads I've tested. Alrighty, now on the topic of moisture, I also wanted to talk about cat hair, dust, and that kind of stuff. Now, due to the surfacing on the Strider being very dense and just because it is slightly uneven, I didn't have any issues with pet hair going into the pad, which actually I was quite surprised. I expect this pad to be a cat hair magnet, but I didn't have any issues with that at all. I did have issues with dust and dirt though, just because that is going to fill up the unevenness of the layering here. So I have a feeling this pad, if you're not keeping it clean, is going to tarnish very quickly. It's probably going to require a lot of washing, specifically on lighter colors like the pink one I have here. The only really downside to how the Strider handles this stuff is you're probably gonna have to wash brush it a little more than you have to do other pads. Alrighty, now one area where Razer has done a really fantastic job here on the Strider, one area I do have to give them a lot of props to, is the overall build quality and QC of the pad. This pad is incredibly well built. It is incredibly well stitched. There's no slow spots with the surface stitching despite the innate unevenness of the surface weaving, so there's no problems with that. The surface stitching is incredibly well done. The base is well implemented. There isn't a loose stitch across this entire pad, which is great to see. Overall, the pad feels fantastic. No QC problems I've been able to find and no inconsistencies over my testing. It is just a very, very well built and very well QC'd pad. All right, now one other area where Razer has done a really good job with here is the base here on the Strider. Now this is a rubber base, but it is a hex design rubber base. Now I will say it does actually work quite well. I do actually like the hex design bases a little more than standard flat ones, because naturally what will happen is that dust and dirt and that kind of stuff from your desk will naturally go in between the kind of cell stitching here or the hex stitching you see here. So it keeps the base a lot more consistent over time, which is really nice to see. So I actually do really like the base here on the Strider. It's actually quite good. It doesn't pass the one finger test. It is reliant on surface stitching for its anchoring, but overall from my testing for pretty much every single grip style I tested, it performed completely fine. No issues with it shifting during use or anything like that. It was just a very well implemented base. No problems here overall. Really well done by Razer. All right, now one area I really did want to highlight that Razer has done another really fantastic job here with is the edge stitching on the Strider. Now this edge stitching is very different from what a lot of other edge stitching we've seen on a lot of other pad. This is actually more of a thick, flat edge stitching, which I actually think is a really, really good thing here. As I mentioned before when I talked about build quality and QC, the edge stitching is perfect. There is not a single loose thread across this entire thing, which is really impressive. But because the edge stitching on the Strider is this thin and wide edge stitching, it doesn't have that kind of bump feeling that you feel on other pads where you rub your arm across it when you're going to do vertical movements. You have that extra bit of drag from the edge of the pad. That really isn't here at all. And because the stitching is very consistent, it's all linear, your arm just goes up and down the sides of the pad with very, very minimal drag, which is really nice to see. Overall, I actually do really quite like this more flat, thinner edge stitching. I really do like this idea. I really do think more pads can implement this, but Razer's done a really good job with that here on the Strider. It is a really cool implementation. No problems for me. It actually performs very, very well. All right, and lastly, I wanted to talk about arm sleeve compatibility. Now, as I mentioned before when I was talking about the performance of this pad and the surface stitching of this pad and the weaving, this pad is very abrasive and has a very rough surfacing to it. So much so where it can cause some issues and kind of cause some irritation to people with very sensitive skin. On top of that, because the surfacing is rough and your arm is very soft, it will cause a lot of additional friction from that. I would highly, highly recommend using an arm sleeve with this pad to cut down on the extra friction you're going to feel on your arm, as well as just to prevent any irritation and that kind of stuff across your arm. Now, of course, as I always do, I tested all of the arm sleeves in my collection. So I tested my Focus Pro sleeve, my SkyPad sleeve, my Pulsar ES sleeve, and my standard athletic sleeve, and they all performed completely fine here on the Strider. They were definitely significantly better than playing on this with bare arms. So again, arm sleeve, highly, highly recommended for consistent performance here on the Strider, and just to prevent any issues with unnecessary friction, and also to prevent any irritation on your arm. All right, now overall, what do I think of the Strider? Overall, I do think that the Strider is a good pad. It's just a very unique pad. I think this pad kind of goes into that gray area where I put the LGG Neptune, where the LGG Neptune is advertised as a speed pad, but it also has a lot of control due to the microtexturing of the surface, and also the softness of that pad does give it a lot more control, which makes that speed pad feel a lot more like a hybrid pad. And then we kind of have the opposite over here, where the Strider is a hybrid pad. It's the best of both worlds of a soft and a hard pad, but it bleeds so far into the speed aspects of this pad and how dynamic it feels for different setups. It fits much more into that area between hybrid and speed. So it kind of falls into the same category as the LGG Neptune. Now, despite the Strider kind of sharing the same gray area between hybrid and speed, do I think this pad is better than the LGG Neptune? No, I don't think it is. I think the LGG Neptune is a much better, well-rounded pad. So overall, I will say the RAZER Strider is definitely a mouse pad. It's not really a mouse pad I can recommend just because there are so many other things in the market that just do it better, but it is a really unique pad that can work for some people in some situations, but the pad is just too dynamic with how it feels overall for me to be able to fully recommend it. But that is going to be everything for my review of the RAZER Strider. Thank you very much for watching. I greatly appreciate it. If you enjoyed the review, please leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future reviews. If you'd like to support the channel, you can become a member here over on YouTube. That is the best way to directly support the channel. I believe it's something like $2 Canadian a month, and you get to directly support me, everything I'm doing here on the channel, and also helps fund the teardown project, where I tear down every mice I cover on the channel to show you how it's built on the inside and how to repair it yourself. Thank you very much again for watching. I greatly appreciate it, and I will catch you guys in the next video. Peace.